The photograph survived by accident. Nearly everything connected to the experiment was burned, shredded, or quietly removed from government archives, but one image escaped. By the end, you'll know what the photograph shows, why authorities classified it for decades, and how a routine destruction order erased the human cost of one of America's darkest psychological programs. At first, the photograph looks almost meaningless. A bare room. A wooden chair. A small table. Heavy curtains covering what might be a window. On the wall, barely visible through the grain, is a circular mark where a clock may once have hung. No dramatic machinery. No uniformed guards. No obvious victim. But look closer. A cable runs beneath the chair. The table holds a glass, an ashtray, and what appears to be a microphone disguised inside an ordinary object. Behind the curtain is a narrow vertical gap, just wide enough for someone in the next room to watch. The photograph carried no public caption. Its original reference number led nowhere. The folder surrounding it had been stripped of nearly every identifying page. For years, researchers could prove only one thing: the image had once belonged to a classified government collection connected to behavioral research. That phrase sounds clinical. Behavioral research. It suggests questionnaires, laboratory mice, perhaps a university experiment conducted under controlled conditions. This was something else. During the early Cold War, American intelligence officials became convinced that enemy governments had discovered methods for controlling the human mind. Prisoners returned from communist countries making strange confessions. Soldiers seemed to abandon beliefs they had held their entire lives. Officials feared an invisible weapon, one that could enter a person's mind without leaving a physical wound. So they began searching for their own version. They funded doctors, chemists, interrogators, hypnotists, military researchers, and private institutions. Some participants volunteered. Many did not. And by the early 1970s, the people overseeing these programs had a new problem. They were no longer afraid the experiments would fail. They were afraid someone would find the records. To understand why the evidence disappeared, you have to enter the logic of the period. After World War II, intelligence agencies collected research from defeated regimes, including studies built on coercion, deprivation, and extreme stress. At the same time, reports from the Soviet Union, China, and Korea fueled fears of brainwashing. The nightmare was simple: what if loyalty could be dismantled like a machine? American officials wanted to know how much pressure a mind could endure before identity began to fracture. Could drugs weaken resistance? Could hypnosis create false memories? Could isolation make someone accept a manufactured reality? Could sleep deprivation turn certainty into confusion? Those questions produced a network of projects, contractors, and front organizations. Money moved through foundations so researchers would not always know who was paying them. Experiments were divided into compartments. One doctor might study sensory deprivation while another examined chemicals or interrogation techniques. Few people could see the entire structure. That was intentional. The best-known umbrella program was MKUltra, approved by the CIA in 1953. But its mythology can obscure what made it truly disturbing. It was not one experiment inside one secret laboratory. It was a system. Universities, hospitals, prisons, military facilities, and private locations became pieces of the same machine. Human beings could be observed, manipulated, dosed, isolated, or psychologically broken, while the paper trail was kept deliberately fragmented. By the 1970s, public trust in the American government was collapsing. The Pentagon Papers exposed official deception. Watergate showed how far authorities would go to protect themselves. Investigative journalists began pulling at threads once considered untouchable. Inside the intelligence world, the danger was obvious. If investigators connected the contracts, names, photographs, receipts, and medical reports, secrecy would no longer be possible. A scattered program would become a visible chain of responsibility. And someone near the top decided the chain had to disappear. In January 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms was leaving the agency. Before he departed, he ordered records connected to MKUltra destroyed. The program's longtime administrator, Sidney Gottlieb, carried out the instruction. Operational files were eliminated in bulk. Reports vanished. Case histories disappeared. Names, locations, and experimental details were reduced to ash or shredded paper. The timing mattered. The order came as political pressure was closing in, but before Congress had fully exposed the intelligence abuses of the era. Destroying the files meant future investigators would be forced to reconstruct the program from fragments. And psychological experiments are especially easy to erase. A missile leaves blueprints. A weapons facility leaves machinery. A battlefield leaves bodies, craters, and witnesses gathered in one place. A covert behavioral experiment may leave only a traumatized person who was never told what happened. If that person reports memory loss, hallucinations, paranoia, or emotional collapse, the symptoms themselves can be used to discredit the testimony. The victim becomes the perfect hiding place for the crime. Officially, the destruction was administrative, obsolete material being cleared under authority. In practice, it removed the documents needed to determine who had been targeted, what substances had been used, and which officials had approved the work. This was not the panicked burning of a single incriminating folder. It was systematic. File numbers were broken. Supporting records were separated. Photographs lost their captions. Payments were routed through vague accounting categories. Institutions could deny knowledge because the documents proving their involvement no longer existed. Years later, when investigators demanded answers, senior officials could truthfully say they did not have the files. But before we get to what the surviving photograph actually shows, you need to understand something even stranger. The government did not recover the story by finding the experimental records. It recovered it by finding the bills. When Helms ordered the files destroyed, the operational archive was targeted. But a separate collection survived because it was stored elsewhere. These were financial records, roughly 20,000 pages involving expenses, contracts, reimbursements, and transfers of money. They were not dramatic confessionals. They were bureaucratic debris. And that is exactly why they escaped. An experiment can be disguised. An accounting system is harder to silence. Someone still has to purchase equipment, rent rooms, pay intermediaries, reimburse travel, and move funds through a front organization. In 1977, those records were located following a Freedom of Information Act request. Their existence triggered new Senate hearings and forced the CIA to acknowledge far more than earlier investigations had established. Imagine reconstructing a destroyed building from its utility bills. You do not see what happened inside each room. But you can identify who rented it, when the lights were on, what equipment was delivered, and which institution paid for it. That was the power of the surviving documents. They revealed relationships among intelligence officers, researchers, hospitals, universities, prisons, and funding organizations. Yet even then, enormous gaps remained. The destroyed operational files had contained the details that mattered most: subjects, methods, results, injuries. Investigators could map the outline, but not restore the lives erased from it. The surviving photograph appeared within this broken archival landscape. Without its original context, it was almost useless. A room is just a room unless you know who entered it. Researchers compared furniture, wall fixtures, recording equipment, reimbursement entries, and descriptions from testimony. Slowly, the image began to align with accounts of controlled spaces designed to appear ordinary. Spaces where observation could happen without consent. And the most disturbing feature was not the chair or the concealed cable. It was the architecture of the room itself. Whoever sat there was meant to believe they were alone. They never were. Some MKUltra activities occurred in clinical environments. Others took place in settings designed to remove the appearance of an experiment entirely. The CIA operated safehouses where people could be watched through concealed observation points. In one notorious operation, later known as Midnight Climax, men were lured into rooms and secretly given LSD. Intelligence personnel observed from behind one-way glass and recorded their reactions. The surroundings were deliberately theatrical: ordinary furniture, suggestive artwork, drinks, music, and objects positioned to conceal monitoring equipment. The room itself became part of the experiment. A subject who knew he was inside a government laboratory might resist, perform, or demand to leave. A subject who believed he had entered a private apartment would behave differently. That difference was valuable to the observers. It also destroyed the possibility of informed consent. The experiments were not limited to testing what a chemical did. Officials wanted to know how confusion could be exploited. Could an altered person be pressured into revealing information? Could embarrassment prevent him from reporting the incident? Could uncertainty make him question his own memory? The researchers were studying more than drugs. They were studying vulnerability. This is why the surviving photograph matters. It captures the physical strategy of the program: make coercion look ordinary. Replace the cell with a furnished room. Replace the visible interrogator with a microphone. Replace force with uncertainty. Yet the image does not prove that every event later associated with these programs happened exactly as described. The missing records make that impossible. That uncertainty has fed decades of exaggeration, rumor, and conspiracy. But it also protected the officials responsible. Whenever a claim grew too dramatic, authorities could dismiss the entire subject as fantasy. Whenever a claim was credible, they could demand documents already destroyed. The truth was trapped between myth and missing paper. Until investigators examined what remained in the frame. The photograph shows an observation room prepared for covert behavioral testing. Not a futuristic mind control machine. Not a supernatural weapon. Something more believable, and therefore more frightening. It shows how a person could be turned into an experimental subject without ever entering a laboratory. The bare chair and table were not random furnishings. The cable was part of the monitoring arrangement. The covered viewing area allowed observers to remain unseen. Objects within reach could hold recording equipment or substances. The controlled layout gave personnel the ability to watch changes in speech, movement, fear, and judgment. The photograph was classified because it exposed method. A name can be denied. A testimony can be attacked. But a purpose-built room reveals planning. It shows that covert observation was not a spontaneous mistake by one reckless researcher. Infrastructure had been created for it. That is the title's answer. The image does not capture the instant a drug was administered. It captures the system waiting for a subject. An empty stage prepared for a human mind. And this is where the destroyed evidence becomes impossible to ignore. If an ordinary room required concealed microphones, observation points, equipment, payments, and trained personnel, then each session generated a trail. Schedules. Notes. Recordings. Photographs. Medical observations. Identities. Most of that material is gone. What survived lets you see the outline of the apparatus, but not the complete list of people placed inside it. The photograph is powerful because of what is missing from the chair. You do not know who sat there. You do not know whether that person ever learned the truth. You do not know whether the psychological damage followed them home, into a hospital, or through the rest of their life. The authorities did not merely classify a disturbing image. They destroyed the index that could have connected it to a human being. Paper was not the only evidence. People survived. Some victims spent years trying to understand abrupt breakdowns, missing memories, or treatments they had never knowingly accepted. Families searched for explanations after relatives entered institutions and emerged profoundly changed. The clearest warning came from cases in which real names and documented connections survived. Frank Olson, an Army scientist, was secretly given LSD by CIA personnel in 1953. Days later, he fell from a hotel window and died. His death became one of the most infamous human consequences linked to the agency's drug experiments. At Montreal's Allen Memorial Institute, psychiatrist Ewan Cameron subjected patients to extreme, depatterning treatments involving drug-induced sleep, repeated messages, and powerful electroshock. CIA-linked funding supported portions of his research. Some patients entered seeking help for comparatively minor conditions and left with devastating impairments. These episodes did not occur in the 1970s. But the attempt to erase their documentary history did. That distinction matters. The experiment stretched across earlier decades. The destruction campaign arrived when exposure became likely. What authorities confronted in the 1970s was not merely a research program. It was an accountability crisis. Congressional hearings eventually revealed secret drug testing, front organizations, and experiments involving unwitting people. Yet lawmakers were investigating an archive that had already been hollowed out. The public received enough truth to be horrified, but not enough to establish the complete count. No definitive list of every subject has ever emerged. That may have been the destruction order's greatest success. This story is often described as a mystery, but that word can be misleading. A mystery suggests the answer was naturally lost. Here, people took action to make the answer harder to recover. Records were destroyed. Programs were compartmentalized. Funding was obscured. Photographs were separated from captions. Victims were kept unaware of their participation. Later investigators were handed fragments and asked to produce certainty. That is not an accidental absence. It is an engineered one. And once evidence disappears, the burden shifts. The institution no longer has to prove it acted legally. The victim has to prove what happened without access to the institution's files. You can see why the photograph remained classified for so long. Its danger was never that it displayed a grotesque machine. Its danger was that it made the operation understandable. You could look at that room and imagine entering it yourself. You might accept a drink. Sit in the chair. Speak freely because the curtains are closed. Hours later, something feels wrong. Your thoughts become unfamiliar. Your memory breaks into pieces. The next morning, there is no official report to request because, according to the world outside that room, no experiment occurred. Decades later, investigators find a photograph. The room is empty. The files are gone. And the people who authorized the program are no longer available to answer questions. That is how an event moves from crime, to rumor, to history, while never becoming fully knowable. The surviving image cannot restore every destroyed name or reconstruct every experiment. But it does something official language cannot. It turns behavioral research back into a physical place. A closed room. An unseen observer. A recording device. A chair waiting for someone who does not know they are part of the test. The darkest secret was not that authorities discovered a perfect method of mind control. They did not. It was that the search itself crossed boundaries officials knew the public would never accept. When exposure approached, the evidence needed for accountability was systematically dismantled. One photograph remained, not because the system wanted you to see it, but because systems make mistakes. A duplicate is misfiled. An expense ledger survives in the wrong building. A classification stamp fades. A researcher asks why an ordinary room required concealed observation equipment. And suddenly, the absence becomes visible. The photograph shows a room prepared for an experiment. The empty chair shows you everything the government succeeded in erasing. If this broke your brain a little, subscribe. We drop one of these every week. Next, a sealed vault of wartime records surfaced 40 years after the war ended. And what historians found inside changed the official story.